Hello, hello. I recently made a post on Twitter and Blue Sky that gained a little bit of traction, so I'd actually like to go into some depth about certain points of design about zombies and skeletons, how they're great introductory creatures, and teach the players about certain aspects of combat, as well as some of the parts of how they break out of the mold of normal creature design. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to open up on the Zombie Shambler. Alright, so here we are with the Zombie Shambler, the least of the zombies, level -1 creature, mindless undead. Now, some things I'm going to point out here that are relatively benign to a zombie, but are going to be important later, that it has the slow ability, which makes it permanently slowed 1 and can't use reactions. That it has 20 hit points, which is well above what a level -1 creature should have. And that it only has single action abilities. It doesn't have any 2-action abilities, but this one does have grab as well, which is a follow-up single action. Of course, pre-remaster, this was much stronger. Nowadays, it's less, but it does still end up trained in athletics, so it's got a decent chance to grab you with no multiple attack penalty with its second action. So, a thing I want to point out, and the sort of crux of zombies here, is that they have really high hit points. Usually they've got a bad AC, but that can vary. They have really high hit points, way higher than they should for their level. If we take a look at building creatures, a level -1 creature on the high end should have 9 hit points. It has the absolute highest end of the next level above it. Or about a moderate level of HP for a creature 2 levels above it. And I point that out because it will become somewhat important to the sort of general design of zombies. So we have the Zombie Shambler again. We have weakness to 2 very accessible damage types. +5, which every cleric is going to have access to, most druids, basically just not wizards. It's going to be incredibly easy to get positive damage, but even easier to get is slashing damage. So zombies are meat sacks. They are bags of blood, whatever you want to call them. They absorb damage, a lot of damage, but they do it not because they're resilient in a way that stops damage, but just because they've got too much meat and they don't feel pain. So you're either using positive damage to disrupt the animating force behind them, which could make them go limp or sear away their undead flesh, or you're using slashing and just hacking it off manually. They have a speed of 25 feet, but are kind of slow because they don't have 3 actions, so they can't cover as much ground as they might like. And of course, most of them are mindless. Not all, but most. And this will also play into hit points somewhat, as you'll see. But the 3 main reasons we'll see a boost in hit points are mindless, slow, and weakness. So we're going to take a look at a stronger zombie, the Zombie Brute, and see that it is level 2 and has 70 HP. It's also slowed, it's also mindless, and it also has slashing 10 and vitality, which is the same as positive, weakness, which this is heightened at this level from 5. But if we again look at building creatures, that lands it solidly between moderate and high for 2 levels higher than it. We're also going to take a look at 2 other zombies. The first one is a zombie that is still mindless, but breaks the mold of 2 levels for HP. So we have the zombie dragon creature level 9, mindless, slowed, weaknesses, 210. And if we look back here, you'll see that that is not appropriate for its level, but it is appropriate for between moderate and high of 1 level higher. So why is this? Why does this break the mold that the Shambler and Brute both followed? Well, it's got action efficiency. It can hit multiple creatures with a single use of its turn. Although it doesn't say what shape its breath weapon is, which it really should. It breathes out a wave of fetid viscera. So we can actually take a look at this and see. It's from Bestiary 3. I would say it's oversight that it doesn't have a range, though reasonably speaking, this is a huge dragon. It's blasting out fetid viscera, and it deals poison damage and sicken 2. So we can look at green dragons, I think, which will be older, but we can find the young green dragon, which is probably somewhat comparable. It's smaller, but it's a similar level, and realistically, breath weapon size is dictated more by level than it is by the actual size of the dragon. So we have a 40-foot cone. So we could say 40 feet, we could say 30 feet because it's a zombie and they get down-tuned a little bit. But nonetheless, it's going to be not a massive area, but a lot more area than most zombies could cover. These sort of advantages that some zombies get kind of backtrack their hit points a little bit to a 1-level boost as opposed to a 2-level boost. And we can also look at the Zombie Lord, which is a much lower level example of this being taken back, not because of action efficiency, but rather because it's not slowed and it's not unintelligent. It can think, act intelligently, and it can use all 3 actions. Such zombies are rare, but not unheard of. Or, I suppose they're uncommon, not rare. But anyway, so you'll notice that it has 80 hit points, which if we go check building creatures, is I forgot to look at its level. It's a level 4. So above high for level 4. But if we look 1 level ahead, again, it lands right between moderate and high, which is a general theme for zombies, is they tend to land between moderate and high for their adjusted level when you're looking at their hit points. And this is the main thing that actually makes them break out of the mold, because you're actively, while still using this table, you're not using this table the way it's laid out if you're building a new zombie. Because if you think, oh, well, it's just higher than high, that tends to start breaking down over time. And if you look at the zombie adjustment, it's different. It just is. It's just different. And we'll talk about the templates a little bit later. But I think it's really interesting that zombies do, right out of the gate, one of the most basic creatures breaks the guidelines for building your own creatures. But there is a recognizable and noticeable pattern that they still follow. And you can see this all throughout design for creatures, from all the way back at the beginning of the game to now, even in the remaster. You see things like this, where there's a break of tradition, so to speak, but there's still a pattern, and it's still balanced because they take time to counteract it. Ready availability of a weakness is a way to counteract high hit points. Same thing with low AC or like hindrances to their ability to take action, like the slow ability that most zombies have. However, non-mindless zombies almost never have slow. So it's an interesting point from both a play perspective, where you're a player and these things are big bags of meat and it's going to take you a lot longer, a lot more hits to take them down if you're using the wrong tool. But if you use the right tool, and the right tool is not hard to come across, you can shred through them pretty quickly. And that all helps balance it out. And balance is important for the game. So if you want your level 4 creature to have an expected power level, it's good generally to work within the guidelines of what building creatures tells you to do. But you can take inspiration from the few times that Paizo goes out and breaks their own rules, or bends them, really, what they're doing here, to show you what's going on. And you can do something similar. You could make another creature that's not an undead. It's just something else, but you give it 2 weaknesses that are incredibly common, say bludgeoning and fire, or bludgeoning and piercing, for example. Any 2 that are incredibly common, extremely accessible to the party, and you can give them more hit points than they're supposed to have. You can go well above high for their level. You can reach into the next level above. Generally, they need to have way more going on that's hindering them to go for 2 levels higher. Like, they only have 2 actions, they can't use reactions, they've got a weakness, all of that sort of stuff. But a lot of times you can still look at that 1 level higher, and it's not going to be game breaking as long as you counterbalance it with something that's easily accessible. And this sort of thing helps with teaching your players how to use recall knowledge, how knowing your enemy can be extraordinarily beneficial, and to sort of complement zombies. Skeletons work in almost exactly the opposite way. They have less hit points. They have less hit points, but they have a lot of resistances and no weaknesses. So let's take a look at a skeletal guard, the most basic of the skeletons. Again, level -1 creature, and it has resistance 5 to cold, electricity, fire, piercing, and slashing. That's a lot for level -1, especially since if we go over to building creatures, you go down here and you look at level -1, maximum resistance guidelines is 1. So they jump up to 5, which in this case is less of a, oh, we're going up 3 levels, and more of a 5's a pretty standard number. And you'll see that throughout a lot of creatures is, while they can have particularly odd numbers and stuff like are listed here, and I do suggest you actually follow these most of the time, a lot of times you're going to see increments of 5. You're going to see 2, 5, 10, 15, and 20. 15 and 20 are pretty rare, but they exist. But so many things are resisted by skeletons. Find the right one. There we go. Cold is common, electricity is common, fire is common. Those are your main damage types for a mage. You've got piercing and slashing, which are 2/3 of physical. So you've got bludgeoning, which will deal normal damage to them, and nothing that expressly jumps out and beats the crap out of them. So this though, right here, 4 hit points. 4 hit points. Even at level -1, that's lower than low. The lowest they suggest is 5. And, wrong one again. And they've got a pretty decent AC for their level as well. This tends to be the sort of shtick with skeletons, so they'll usually have a decent or normal or better AC with poor fortitude, good dex, really low hit points, and resistance to a bunch of damage. But because they've got low hit points, the few right tools, which are just anything that their resistances don't cover, work well against them. You're going to mow them down faster because they have a smaller pool, or just by using overwhelming force with one of the things they do resist. A horde of skeleton guards is still going to fall to your average fireball, regardless of reducing it by 5, because you're throwing out 5d6 and your average damage there is going to be like 15 on average, I think. So they're still getting smoked by that, but they might resist a burning hand, or ignition or produce flame if you're still using produce flame. So we can look at a skeletal champion and we notice that they don't adjust as much for being intelligent. They've still got the same resistances, which are still higher than average for their level at creature level 2. But it has a steel shield. So if you do go after it with a bludgeoning weapon, you can try and reduce that some more. So they're more intelligently designed on average. We can look at the skeletal titan, which is mindless, does not have a means of additional defense, such as a shield. Rather, it opts for overwhelming destruction and has higher resistances, particularly in piercing and slashing, the more readily available damage types. Mostly because at this point, level 13, you're going to see weapon expertise with mastery and them dealing, 3-4 extra damage on every strike just because of class features, whereas spells don't really benefit from that. And they've got a bunch of stuff that they can do. They're far more active than zombies, most generally. Skeletons are. But we've got level 13 and 210, the same hit points as our level 9 zombie dragon. So they're solidly in moderate, but this is a brute. This is a brute style character with only moderate hit points. You'll also see this sort of thing sort of fall off a little bit later on in the game for more common styles of creature, because you're kind of expected to know by now. Pick your weapons correctly. Early on, they're a little more forgiving, because, well, if you run into a bunch of skeletons and you don't know how to fight them, it's going to absolutely mark you. If you're, dealing 1d4 plus 1 damage to something that can't take that much damage. Sure, your fighter can probably power through it, and your barbarian, but your wizard, your rogue, they might not be able to do anything about these guys at super low levels, even a level -1 version. So skeletons teach your players use the right tool or it's going to go badly. Zombies teach your players use the right tool and things will go well. So they both teach your players that knowledge is useful. This is a way to get your players into using recall knowledge early on in the game and to see that whenever they come up against a new creature, it's a useful thing to check on their weaknesses and resistances. Just so that you can save yourself a lot of trouble in destroying them. And zombies are incredibly common, skeletons are incredibly common at early level games. How many people have gone into a crypt within the first few sessions or just stumbled across a skeleton or zombie because bad necromancer or the ground's just unhallowed, something along those lines. Zombies and skeletons are a great sort of litmus test for being strange and breaking the bounds of the normal rules for building creatures. They've got higher resistances and higher weaknesses than is suggested. one has lower hit points than suggested, and one has much, much higher hit points than suggested. And these also show us that these guidelines, while important for almost everything else, to maintain balance, if you know what you're doing and you like to experiment, you can go outside the normal bounds of what's shown and still make a creature that is perfectly balanced, works well, is thematic, and can be very memorable. I think most people remember zombies and skeletons a lot because they're fairly generic, but yeah, you can do a lot with them. And they engage your players in behaving a certain way, or at least not behaving in a certain way, which is really good. It brings out the tactics in the combat. And you won't see them have like massively changed things to like their strikes or anything like that. It's only going to be between resistances, health, and actions, usually. But everything you do to counterbalance one thing on a creature can be a place where you let them shine in another. This is a pretty broad category. So you don't have to perfectly follow all of these rules or guidelines when creating a creature or when adjusting a creature. But you probably should until you're more comfortable with the system, because you might make something that is too strong, or you might make something that's too weak. But another piece of advice there is, unless you're writing a book, you're making a product to sell, it's fine. It's fine if you mess up. You don't have to be perfect with every single design you make. You can make something new, give it a try, and if it doesn't work out, change it or move on to the next thing. You can do that. You're perfectly within your power to. You might not want to be super experimental with the end game boss or the end chapter boss of your campaign, because you might, cause a few issues. So throw it in earlier in the campaign, earlier in the chapter. Something similar, something that not only can, one, teach your players about something they might have to deal with later, so that they're not blindsided by a new mechanic, and it gives good thematic cohesion, but also mechanical cohesion. And at least in my opinion, that's a really good thing for a game, where you can have these seeds, these little crumbs of what's to come. Maybe you've got a mad alchemist that is creating mutants of some kind that your party's having to fight. And each one of these things has a different strength or place where it shines, or a different weakness. And later on, all those little things are combined into that alchemist as they mutate themselves into the quote-unquote ultimate being. But you can exploit their old weaknesses. You can avoid their strength. And players love that shit. So I really suggest being cognizant of your design and where you can break it, as well as experimenting often. And the more you do that, the better you'll get at designing things. And you might design things in a specific sphere. You might just do creatures. You might do items. You might do spells. The more you do, the more you test, the more feedback you get, and the more experience you get, the better you will get. And I just realized that I forgot to talk about the adjustments. So let's go talk about the adjustments from Book of the Dead. So here, these are to quickly take a creature that already exists. Like, say you want to go take an adamantine dragon from Bestiary or from Monster Core, and you want to make it undead. Well, it was built initially with a different balance in mind. It did not have the initial oddities of the zombie or the skeleton in mind. So these adjustments are meant to kind of push you in the right direction, but be quick and easy enough that you could do it, if not on the fly, with only a few minutes of preparation. So you get in the ballpark, even if it's not quite perfect. So you get mindless undead and zombie, you increase hit points, and they get slowed. So what happens if you don't want to use slowed? Give them less hit points. That would be my suggestion. Probably use the tier below, or so like if it's 16 to 19 and you don't want to give them slowed, maybe give them only 75 instead. But generally speaking, you're going to probably want to look at it and go, okay, the thematics of the zombie is that they are slow, so that's a good thing to have. But maybe the creature has reactions that are really neat and it kind of falls flat without those. We'll give them, split the difference, or maybe increase their weaknesses. And maybe keep them slowed but can use reactions. This adjustments in general are a sort of band-aid for creating speed for precision. So you can quickly adjust a creature using an adjustment, whether it's the elite and weak adjustments or whether it's zombie and skeleton adjustments. You'll notice that the themes do stick here. Our zombies have a lot of hit points and a lot of weakness, where our skeletons lose hit points but gain a lot of resistance. And they do have lower resistances than most actual built skeletons do at lower levels. And that's just because, once again, those creatures were already made with a balance in mind. And that balance did not reflect the boons, benefits, and drawbacks of being a zombie or being a skeleton. So these are somewhat of an interim, a stopgap to make things quicker. Whereas a custom creature is almost always just going to be better and more well-rounded in design. It also takes, an hour or two to make a solid creature. Sometimes longer, depending on how complex it is. But you can do this in a matter of 1 or 2 minutes. So it's simple and it's quick. But I've kind of been doing this as a train of consciousness, so I think I hit everything. Let me know what you think about how zombies and skeletons are designed in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. How you, blah, 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 words. If you like building creatures, do you use the guidelines or do you look more at other monsters beforehand? Do you do both? I do a lot of both. I'm very familiar with the system at this point, so I have to reference these a lot less than, a new player or a new GM might have to. But I'd love to know what your thoughts are on creature design and just the design of Pathfinder 2nd Edition in general. And until next time, peace.